Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Adventures Through the Mind podcast. I am your host, James W. Jesso. So today's guest is going to be author and music historian Martin Torgoff. I read his book, Bop Apocalypse, Jazz, Race, the Beats and Drugs a couple months ago and really thoroughly enjoyed it, not only educationally, because I learned a lot about jazz music, which I was really interested in, and the history of drug culture in the United States, and also the history of how much drug culture played a role in the development and the evolution of jazz music, which was also, those two things were also coupled with the sort of dissolving of racial segregation boundaries within the youth culture, which was also coupled with the emergence of the Marijuana Tax Act and the early years of cannabis prohibition, and then ultimately into the so-called drug war, and just to see how everything was so intimately related. I learned a lot, and also I was really powerfully affected by some of the content. I really like jazz music, and that was interesting, and I obviously and I obviously really enjoy learning about drug culture. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this show. But I found myself really deeply emotionally invested in the book as well. The way that the people he was writing about, the way he represented their lives, the way, as you'll hear in the interview, we talk about him dropping into the living reality of being those characters at that time and the environment that they were living in. It really deeply impacted me, especially when it started to get into the role heroin addiction played in the lives of a lot of these musicians, and when it gets into Harry J. Anslinger and his fervent racist motives behind the war on drugs, that really started to affect me on a deep level, with sometimes deep sadness, and other times, especially in regards to Anslinger, deep, somewhat violent rage towards this man and everything that he did against basically the Black people of the United States, as well as a lot of people who have deeply suffered since then due to the implementation of the drug war. Although the drug war didn't start till Nixon, sort of the battle against cannabis specifically, and then heroin, the battle against drugs in America definitely started in the 20s or so. Before we get into the interview, just a couple announcements around the podcast. I have been working for the last few months pretty intensely into building a new face for the website, which is now up and running. It includes a mascot that you probably saw if you're watching this on YouTube in the intro part of the video, but is up there on the website. It was designed by a good friend of mine, an incredible artist designer, Eduardo Kine. And I'm really feeling good about the new direction that this logo mascot is going to help carry the podcast, because I think it's really catchy, a little bit catchier than my face, which was the previous logo, and also the new website I think will be a lot easier to navigate and a lot more appealing for people. And yeah, it's been a lot of work actually, and it feels in a way like a bit of a womb that I'm about to burst out of, especially since I've been somewhat haphazardly working with the same WordPress site for 5 years or something, and was really there was a lot to learn, but I'm really excited about seeing this launch, and I would love to get your feedback on it. So jameswjesso.com, please check out the site, let me know what you think about it. Be easy on my feelings if you think it's absolutely horrible, but if you think it's absolutely horrible, I'm totally down for some good critical feedback too. Obviously Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at jameswjesso is where you can connect with me or comment on the post that you are listening or seeing this through, or directly on the website, send me an email, whatever. Part of the changes that are coming along with the website is also a change in the name of the podcast. So it's been ATTMind Radio since it started, which was always a reference to Adventures Through the Mind, but was not very intuitive if you didn't already know, and was terribly branded. So before the podcast, assuming that it continues to grow, before it grows too much bigger, going to make that switch. So as of the next episode, you're not going to be able to find it searching ATTMind Radio. It will be called Adventures Through the Mind, and hopefully that doesn't cause too many broken links in the long run. So yeah, that's it for announcements. As you might notice, this intro is a little different than it typically is. I'm experimenting with different things, like how authentic can I be? Because it's really difficult for me to do these things. I tend to try to show up, and then it comes off a little bit forced, and so I'm actually just drinking coffee first thing in the morning, trying not to make a big thing out of it, just showing up real as me with this new mic that you can probably see right here. Just experimenting with it and seeing if it works. How does the sound feel? Do you guys like it more or less? Again, Twitter, blah, 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 social media. One last couple things before we get into the interview, that is that I got a couple more 5-star reviews on iTunes, and I'd like to give some big love shout out to those reviewers by reading their reviews. So Vorian14 from the USA says, incredible depth in the fungi kingdom. James has a way to blend information for novice and experts in mycology and psychedelics at large. It's great to hear honest, in-depth conversations on the regular with ATTMind. Thank you. And then Lucid Dream Reality 333. It's actually spelled that way. I'm not just having a weird moment. They say, they're from Canada. They say, important content. I often recommend this podcast to anyone who asks me about psychedelics or its applications in emotional healing. I am always impressed with each episode and recommend it for anyone looking for enrichment and fresh perspectives in psychology, trauma, and altered states of consciousness. It's a great source of alternative education, and I'm so glad this information is now available to the public and not only in institutional setting. So important. Well, thank you, Lucid Dream Reality 3333. Of course, if you're listening to this and you haven't left a review and you would like to, you get it read on the show. And I was thinking about this because I think it's really cool that you could get your review read on the show and get a shout out. But since it's my show and I say it's cool, it's kind of like if your mom says you're cool, which might not count, but I personally think that it counts. Speaking of shoutouts, just want to give a big shout out to Lisa and Dana, who offered some PayPal donations. Thank you so much for your generous contribution to the show, and also a shout out to all of my patrons on Patreon and the generosity and support you have been showing me. I am really, really appreciating it, because without the direct fan funding support, this podcast does not continue to grow, and it doesn't continue to maintain economic sustainability. So thank you so much for helping grow the foundation that allows this podcast and my investment into it to blossom fully and feed back into all parties' benefit, hopefully. If you listening want to become a patron and get dialed in to the fun little inside club that the Patreon patronage tribe get to participate in, you can head to jameswjesso.com/support and take a look at what Patreon is all about. Personally, I use it because it's really, really easy, but also because it enables me to have a direct relationship with the people who are funding the show, and hopefully in the future be able to maintain this show and the economic costs and growth of this show without turning to things like advertising or sponsorship or product placement or anything like that. That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this slow early morning intro to episode 47 of the Adventures Through the Mind podcast. Please enjoy my conversation with Martin Torgoff. Hello, listeners of ATTMind Radio. Today we have Martin Torgoff on the show. For more than 3 decades, Martin has been at the forefront of major media trends and cultural currents, documenting and telling the story of America through the evolution of its popular culture. An award-winning journalist, author, and prize-winning and best-selling books, documentary filmmaker, and Emmy-nominated television writer, director, and producer of shows that have been seen by millions, his work has encompassed music, art, film, theater, literature, politics, history, biography, sexuality, sports, sociology, and celebrity culture. As the New Yorker puts it, quote, Martin Torgoff has been writing books and making films about sex, drugs, and rock and roll for 30 years. Welcome to the show, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I've got you on the show today because of this book here. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see it, Bop Apocalypse, which is your newest book. And essentially, as far as I could tell, seems to outline the history of the influence drugs has had on racial segregation, jazz music, beat poetry, the counterculture, and generally the political social atmosphere around prohibition since the early 20s upwards until about, I think it's the mid 50s is when you sort of like bring it to a close.
Well, I really, in my mind, I always had the cutoff as like 1960. I go up to through the death of Billie Holiday, and a lot of the characters. I mean, in an epilogue, I sort of follow them beyond that to sort of show a sense of what's going to happen in the future in the 60s and 70s. What's so fascinating about this period is it's when the templates are all created for this stuff. I mean, there really isn't anything that you can see going on in drug culture today that did not have its template in this period that I write about. And so it's kind of a living history as I see it.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a living history in the sense that reading it for myself, I felt like I was dropping in to the living reality, almost a palpable experience of being there in those times and following the stories of the people that you biography, which is really cool because it's not just like this happened and this happened and then this happened. It was really telling the story of those times through these incredible biographies of various important cultural icons of that era.
Yeah. My last book, which was published in 2004, it was called Can't Find My Way Home, America in the Great Stoned Age. That book was really about what happened when drugs went from the underground to the mainstream, from, these subcultural enclaves, whether jazz or beat generation, to, an experience that more than 1 in 4 Americans would have with illicit drugs. I mean, at one point, something like 40% of the people in the United States admitted to having used an illicit drug at some point or another. And, that ranged from everyone, who smoked marijuana casually to might have, done psychedelics to, could have been addicted to heroin or abused cocaine or whatever, but it was a remarkable thing, and so a lot of my work is about understanding that phenomenon and how it shaped the popular culture of this country. And while I was doing that research, I just delved massively into the roots of it, into the genesis of it, into jazz, into, Bohemia. So whereas that book was about the drugs going from the underground, the arc, to the mainstream, this book is really about how the use of these drugs got into the DNA of the culture to begin with. It's really the story of the underground in a way. Go ahead.
Yeah, it really definitely feels that way, and that kind of leads me into the first sort of primary question I have, which is myself. I was, and I assume you did too. I was born and raised into a drug culture, a drug education, something similar to the DARE program. A police officer would come in and show us all the drugs and talk about all the horror stories, and we were told to just say no, and there was an intense stigma around it. And this paradigm is not only inaccurate, this idea that only losers do drugs, but it's also really dangerous. And the danger of this ignorant stigma and prohibition is outlined quite nicely in your book. And in the introduction, you sort of talk about your own, I guess, the evolution of your own relationships with drugs having also been sort of conditioned into the stigma, and the pros and the cons in your relationship to those things. What brought you from being, I mean, pardon me if this comes off, accidentally offensive, but in the conventional American upbringing, into writing a book on the very origins of drugs being sewn into American culture?
Well, all of this is personal for me. It began with my own interest in really grappling with the meanings of it. And it's a complex subject, so there are multiple meanings. My own personal relationship with drugs began November 4th, 1968. I was a high school junior. It was the night Richard Nixon was elected president, because I was downstairs in the basement of my parents' suburban home on the North Shore of Long Island. And I had an older sister who was really kind of an early hippie in our hometown. She had been out to San Francisco. She came back and she brought all of that stuff back with her. And so the whole 60s were kind of percolating down there in the basement. And at one point, it just became obvious to me that, she'd smoked marijuana. And I was naturally interested. Not many kids in my hometown were smoking it at all at that time. Very few. And so we began this discussion about it. I have a really great relationship with my sister, and I trusted her. I always admired her in ways, her kind of adventurous spirit. And I was interested. And I was the sort of kid that had, I guess you could say, a predisposition to mind-expanding experiences. From the earliest time, I have been up in my head, living in a world of stories and images and, cultural meanings. I was always like an observer, and I was always trying to figure things out. And so somehow I crossed that threshold into just thinking about this, to being willing to try it. Even though, we didn't have anything like the DARE program, but we had other things. It was widely assumed, you heard this from authorities and also from your parents, the so-called gateway theory. this idea that had come out of the 1950s, created by Harry Anslinger, that if you smoke marijuana, it was inevitable you were going to become a heroin addict. So don't smoke marijuana, whatever you do. And so despite that, I decided to give it a try. I mean, it was always in the back of my mind, because when you hear something like that, you remember it. And I totally understand what you mean by the danger of this kind of like mindless prohibition, because what happened to me was that, I had this really transformative experience that night. And I started smoking it. And when I saw that there was no evidence that I was going to become a heroin addict anytime soon, it just gave me license to smoke more and more marijuana. And I think that was largely the story of a lot of people in my generation. But in my own case, in the beginning, it definitely created openings for me that were very tangible. Allen Ginsberg in my book talks about how, his early experiences with marijuana were like an educational experience. And I totally get that. It was like that for me. I remember it so vividly because as I got really high, when she really understood how high I was, she said, "Come over here." And she had this little stereo, these little speakers. And she just said, "Put your head between those speakers." And I said, "Really? Okay." And she put on Blue Jay Way from the Magical Mystery Tour. There's that opening where it fades in that organ, that like churchly organ. And it just, wow. The expression was blowing your mind. And it was that in the truest sense. And, that was the beginning of a period in my life of real self-discovery, going down in that basement with these little smidgens of marijuana by myself and largely listening to music, but also, reading some of the things that she had down there. And she had some of the Beat Generation literature. She had the poem Howl, for example. She had the book On the Road. And so that was also about discovering that, but it was also about going out and having these adventures, these sensual adventures in my hometown. I lived in a town that was on the North Shore, so there was the water down there, and there were, gardens and forests, and it was truly mind expanding. And little by little, I found my cohorts, the few kids and friends that also began smoking pot. And that began the connection, the sort of stone brotherhood, the sort of beginnings of the counterculture. This was 68, so, it had been a couple of years since all of this stuff was going on in San Francisco and the West Coast. In New York, it was the East Village. And my sister moved to the East Village. So my last couple of years in high school, I would go in and visit her in the city. And St. Mark's Place was like a carnival, it was like an incredible psychedelic carnival. And she took me to the Fillmore East, and I saw just extraordinary music there. And that set me off into a 21-year run that pretty much encompassed at one point or another the entire pharmacopoeia. And when it was over, and I had crashed and burned at the end, it was, my crash and burn came mostly on cocaine and alcohol. And when I kind of came out of all that, I went through this period of really, really looking back and going, wow, how did all that happen and what did it mean? And it was a tangle of things. I had mixed feelings about it. I was aware that some of the substances had opened me and benefited me, such as cannabis and some of the psychedelics in my early years, and that others, like hard drugs, had closed me, had numbed me, had damaged me in some ways. And so I had a real tangle of emotion about, well, how do I feel about drugs now? How do I feel about drug policy now? And the thing that astonished me more than anything was how we didn't seem to be learning anything. There seemed to be this cultural amnesia about drugs. It had been this was like the end of the 80s, the early 90s, when I was coming out of my thing. And I saw, the society kind of moving ahead. We had been through this huge wave of cocaine. Ecstasy had come in. The rave culture was flourishing. Crack had really raged through the inner cities. And I was looking at all of that stuff, and it was all so vastly different. And I was really trying to understand it. And I decided to write about it. The first part of the agenda was going to be writing about me. The second part of the agenda was going to be writing about my generation. And the third part, what it eventually led to, was going to be about writing about my country and how it had changed my country. So that sent me off on a 12-year odyssey of research, and, I interviewed hundreds of people. I was very fortunate to talk to a lot of the major characters before they passed on, whether it was Timothy Leary or Allen Ginsberg or, that produced my first book, which led to a television series based on that book called The Drug Years. There hadn't really been a good documentary series on the drug culture either. I mean, there were. See, what my work has been about regarding drugs is that there are people who have written about many different aspects of this, whether it's Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, or a book about Studio 54, or a book about Billie Holiday, or a book about the war on drugs. What I didn't see was anyone coming along and contextualizing it all into a narrative that really somehow looked at the arc of the whole thing and put it in that sort of multi-frame perspective, as a filmmaker, as well as a writer. You understand that there are different kind of focal planes to any shot, and they all have different kinds of values to telling a story. One is the wide shot, which shows everything. The other is a medium shot, whether it's a two shot or someone, a group of people, or, one individual talking. And then, of course, there's the close-up, and then there's the extreme close-up. And my writing has always been like that. I tell the story as exactly as if it's a film, even though I guess not writing novels is very much that way too. You don't see it that much in nonfiction writing, and that's what I always try to do, because I think it's to me the most expressive and valuable way to tell a story. If you're a nonfiction writer. So the first part, I love, one of the best things to me about being a writer is, you get to learn about stuff. And that was, to study drugs and write about drugs is a wonderful way to learn about things, because you need to know about so many things to write about them well. You need to know pharmacology and law enforcement and communication arts and spirituality and sexuality. And it just goes on and on and on. And the parts of the story that I was least familiar with were the parts about jazz and the origins. Because, I was a teenager in the 1960s. I didn't grow up in the jazz culture. I mean, I knew a little something about it. I did not come to the pleasures of jazz until I was well into my 20s, when I lived in New York and was working in New York. I grew up on the Beatles and Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix and all of that kind of stuff. But as I got into my 20s and the 70s, I became fascinated by jazz. And this to me was really a great opportunity to really delve into it. And when I really began looking at the whole story of the origins of drugs, it was amazing to me because marijuana really arrives on the streets of New Orleans at exactly the same time that jazz is coalescing. Like the first decade of the 20th century, literally around 1910, 1911. Scholars of, cannabis would corroborate that. Scholars of jazz would corroborate it. But no one had kind of like made the connection in an obvious kind of way as, both of them moved forward. And you can really follow it, you can really follow it in New Orleans, in Storyville. And then Storyville is closed down and the musicians go up the Mississippi River and the marijuana comes up along with them to Chicago in the form of Louis Armstrong. And this small group of musicians who, begin smoking it and become known as tremendous musical innovators. At the same time, they are, users of cannabis. And then you can follow it across to Harlem in the form of Mesro. And then you follow it down to Kansas City and what happened there. And then Kansas City comes to New York. And it's just like a very kind of, it's a perfectly linear narrative. And, then these things happen along the way. Like, in 1943, this incredible jazz musician, Lester Young, meets the 21-year-old Jack Kerouac one night in the West Village, the student at Columbia who's just starting to get into jazz. And they share a cab ride up to Minton's, where the bebop revolution is beginning to happen. And Prez, that was the nickname of Lester Young, he gives Kerouac his first marijuana. And it changes his life. Very similar to the way marijuana changed my life. So, then you have this connection, this palpable connection to this small circle of writers who are just beginning to come together, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in the 1940s. William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac, who were all, of course, fascinated by drugs and really interested in experimenting and seeing how the drugs could somehow shape their consciousness about life and writing. And so those two influences, jazz and these substances, both go funneling into that scene. And then it becomes a matter of, well, you just kind of cross-cut between them, and it's just like the whole thing moves forward. But the other part of the narrative, and this is an amazing thing because it also goes right back to this beginning, is, of course, the whole regime of drug prohibitionism.
So before we jump into drug prohibition, I want to narrow in on something that you said explicitly and sort of was slowly being implied about sort of cannabis being a gateway drug, and also this relationship to music, and how you mentioned almost the same, like cannabis opened you up in a similar way that cannabis opened up Jack Kerouac, to cannabis opening up America insofar as jazz music and even jazz music of itself. It almost seems like, in a way, cannabis is a gateway drug, but it's like a gateway drug to being illuminated on how many lies you've been told, and which leaves you stumbling around a lack of truth. And even the archetypal process almost of being awakened, stumbling around in a bunch of untruth until we hurt ourselves and get clear, and then go back and try to figure out what it all means. Even this is a process that's been similar in my life. And I want to narrow in on the illumination possibilities of cannabis, especially in and around music. In the early stages of your book, you really zoom in to this close-up of cannabis and the way it can awaken a relationship to music that is otherwise almost inconceivable if you don't already have it as a natural inclination within yourself. And the spread of cannabis across the lines of racial segregation in the early 20s. Can you talk about cannabis, that cultural era, and what it was doing for the blurring of racial divide at that time?
Yeah, it's a really important part of the story, and it's something that is very controversial for many reasons. The African American community is enormously sensitive to the subject because, the drug laws evolved directly out of a innate kind of racism. There isn't a single drug law on the books that was not put on the books without, some idea of how this is going to be used to control what they thought was the black population of the United States. And so they were, penalized and incarcerated at a rate always that was far greater than, Caucasians. And also this idea of fear, of racial fear. Fear of what? Well, the most obvious fear was the commingling of black and white together culturally. And then beyond that, the greater fear was the whole idea of the boundaries between interracial sex falling as a result of it. And it's very clear cut, these two fears, in the evolution of the drug laws and also in the role that these things played in the commingling of jazz, marijuana, and, the sort of cultural percolations that happen. I mean, jazz became, without a doubt, the purest form of cultural miscegenation in the United States. It was a place where white people and black people could actually be together and form authentic relationships, around this music. If you look at a place like the Savoy Ballroom in New York in the 1930s, it was really one of the only places in America where young white Americans and young Negroes, as they were called at the time, could actually dance together. And what was happening there? Big band jazz and this whole cannabis culture that became known as, Viper culture. So it was all there in the pot together. And that was pretty much the story from the beginning. What a lot of people don't understand is that cannabis became a part of a true movement that was about interracial experience, that was really about multiculturalism, all of it happening around jazz, that was happening underground. This was not the larger African American population. Jazz was always an avant-garde culture of the night. And in Black culture, there's always been a dichotomy between what they refer to as, Sunday morning and Saturday night. Those two things have always been very much, obviously they sort of commingle, but it's different. There's always been a part of the African American experience that has been traditional. You could even call it conservative. You could even call it, religious. And that is why when bebop came along, there were a lot of Black critics of it right along with white critics. But at the same time, you had this part of the population that was really about exploring, adventure, experimenting, connections, openings, and that is where cannabis came. That it was like, and the man who decided to devote his life to trying to control, stop, and destroy this was very much focused on it. Harry Anslinger, the whole, the first drug law in 1914, the Harrison Narcotic Act. Jazz was already coalescing. Cocaine niggers, the Black cocaine fiend was a part of the whole testimony that was, that evolved the first major law against narcotics. All right. So then Harry Anslinger comes along. He takes charge of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics at 1930. He will run it for the next 32 years. No one even comes close to that kind of autocratic control of a part of the American government, except for J. Edgar Hoover, and they were rivals. So here comes this man who's a xenophobe and a racist and thinks that cannabis will do everything to give full vent to like the deepest, most animalistic urges and impulses that we have, being like an old line Calvinist, that's what he saw. And he understood the fear that he could exploit. So if you really look at the three signature images of a person who smoked pot during the time that he put in motion the campaign that led to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the crazy, hysterical reefer madness campaign, marijuana, assassin of youth. You see three images that he puts forth. One is of an axe murderer. There was someone who went crazy and, murdered his family in Florida. And Anslinger claimed it was because he smoked pot. So that was the first image. If you smoke it, you'll go berserk and kill people. Then the second image was that of like a schoolyard pusher. Someone who was going to show up at a schoolyard and, hey kid, come over here, and give a kid a reefer so that he could get hooked. And the third image was a Negro jazz musician who was going to, of course, corrupt the youth, the white youth of, America through this music, and at the same time, sexually corrupt young white girls who are going to become enthralled with them, and their music. And those you see, and eventually, whatever gains, the people who eventually, why did people do it? Why did it endure? Why did it grow at the same time that all of this demonization was happening? And it was because people were finding something in it. They were finding something that served a kind of hunger, a kind of desire, whether it was innate and human or whether it was cultural, whether it was racial, spiritual. So that was one reason. And the other one was there was really, as this culture started, underground culture coalesce, it was like the beginnings of the culture, what became known as the culture war in the United States. It would take many different forms, but this is the genesis of it. And it was a war declared by the federal government in the form of this one man against this entire subculture of people who were commingling together at these places, white and black, gay and straight, writers, musicians, and along with what had always been identified as a criminal class, hustlers, smugglers, black marketeers. So there was always that mixture of, these kind of like cultural explorers and the criminal, which was in a way fascinating and in another way an excuse for the authorities to just crack down.
As I was reading about Anslinger in your book, there was moments where I got so angry, I would shake the book and just be like, "Oh, you fucking son of a bitch. It's all your fault," and I got really upset, especially when you were getting the moments where, of course, there's this incredibly racist, language and paradigm and perception, stigma that's getting pushed, which in and of itself is obviously a lie. But there was also explicit lies, detractions, and lobbying against the truth that was happening at this time too, right? Fighting against anything that might lean towards, the issue with cannabis not being as extreme as Anslinger said. You quote in your book, or you say in your book that I'm going to quote you, "The prohibition of drugs in America was always a war to save civilization. And the first casualty of war, as the great Greek dramatist, Aeschylus, thank you, so famously wrote, is the truth." Can you talk about some of the things that Anslinger, that were progressive developments and what was actually happening with cannabis in American culture that Anslinger squashed and suppressed?
Well, I'll give you the classic example of it. He tried to really squash the jazz culture. He had this one thing called the Marijuana and Musicians File, and he began collecting dossiers, on all of these people, these artists, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, they were all in there. And what he was really trying to do was to penetrate the circles of jazz with informants and set them up for arrest. So that was one thing he was trying to do. It turned out to be unsuccessful in the beginning because it was a very tight-knit culture, and they were very kind of hip to these new people coming around, and a lot of the so-called early narcs, they were pretty obvious, and so it wasn't so easy for him to do that in the beginning. When heroin came along, it became a different story. But in the 1940s, the then mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, decided that he was going to find out for himself, what the truth was about this. LaGuardia was a very independent man. He didn't take shit from anyone. He was respected by, people of many different communities within the city and in the larger society. And he was hearing all of these things about, cannabis caused crime, cannabis caused crimes of sexual excess, cannabis led to violent crime, cannabis was a corrupter of the young, etc. And he decided that he was going to find out the truth. So what he did was he organized the first and most extensive, what would later become known as an ethnographic study of what the truth was. I mean, who are the people who were smoking it? What were they about? Where did they go? What did they do? What happened to the places? What happened to the people? How many of them have been arrested? What were their ages, etc.? And he put together this group of people who were going to study it. He had the complete cooperation of the medical establishment and the law enforcement establishment in New York. And so that the results of that study, which became known as, and the funny thing is that the first great marijuana dealer in Manhattan was this guy Mesro, who had been a legitimate jazz musician, but really became famous as a pot dealer. And he later wrote a classic book called Really the Blues, which was really the first great book about that culture. And he had been arrested and thrown into jail. He got busted at the World's Fair in the late 1930s. And they threw him in jail. They threw him, in one of the New York City prisons. And he kept seeing these people would be like, they would kind of disappear. And, they would come back and he would say, what happened? Where'd you go? And they told him about this study. They were like, brought to this place and interviewed by these sociologists and these, reporters and these, these police officials and doctors. And, and that's how Mesro found out about the LaGuardia report. But what happened was, when it came out, Anslinger completely squashed it. I mean, he destroyed it. He got the AMA, the American Medical Association, to discredit it, and he suppressed it to the degree that it was literally practically impossible to find copies of it anywhere. There were only a few in some of the scholarly archives in the Public Library of New York that still existed. And when Allen Ginsberg was a young college student at Columbia, getting interested in, smoking and all these other things, when Mesro's book came out in 1946, that's how he found out about the LaGuardia report. And he and William Burroughs went digging and digging and digging, and somehow, found a copy of it. And when they read that, they suspected, of course, the whole incredible propaganda of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. But when they came across that, they really saw, an example of the skullduggery of what was going on. And that was like really an important part of Ginsberg's own kind of political understanding of how, if any kind of reform of marijuana law, any kind of movement to decriminalize it or legalize it would have to be a political movement, because, it was completely orchestrated by the U.S. government. So it was, there's a real example of what was going on.
Mm-hmm. And that same suppression of the truth and
just let me interject one thing.
Yeah, okay.
What the LaGuardia report did was it categorically, statistically refuted every one of Anslinger's claims about marijuana that he had made like over the previous 15 years. Every single one.
Yeah, that was a piece that just like really, really, really got me all fired up. I mean, I was already angry with what he was doing, but that stark repression of the truth trying to emerge to face down and defeat his lies, having been squashed, was just like very frustrating.
Well, that's what makes Ginsberg's story so interesting, because, in addition to being, to becoming this, epic poet, he became one of the first, really important marijuana rights activists. And he took Anslinger on. I mean, there was an incident that I write about in the book where one of the principal beat characters, Neil Cassidy, the fellow that became Dean Moriarty in Kerouac's book On the Road, who is just a voracious smoker of marijuana, at one point was set up and arrested and thrown into San Quentin prison for three joints. And Ginsberg was so outraged that it really began his whole life as an activist. I mean, eventually, within a few years, he would write a letter to Harry Anslinger attacking him and announcing that, that calling him a disgrace, and saying that, he was going to pursue through political means the legalization of marijuana in America. Now, when you think about that, no one was even admittedly, saying in public that they smoke pot. Here's a guy, a gay beat poet, challenging the federal, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Think about the moxie it took to do that. And from that time on, that was the beginning of Ginsberg's FBI file. From that time on, anytime anyone made any, statement about how the marijuana law should be changed, it went into Ginsberg's FBI file.
Yeah, the realization that Ginsberg was essentially the first pot activist was a really interesting one for me. Also, that he's probably the only one of that group of the beat poets that sort of made it out mostly unscathed from the depths that they all sort of went into. It was interesting. Another one that was interesting, and I'm just going to do a quick jump back before I move into the next question, is Louis Armstrong as sort of the first sort of champion of cannabis in a way, and just being a voracious smoker, hitting blunts bigger than Method Man long before Method Man was even a thing, and it made so much sense why all the pictures that I see of Louis Armstrong, he's smiling ear to ear with his eyes half closed, because he's just yeah, life.
Yeah. I mean, he was an important character in the story. I mean, and he was really the first great jazz innovator who, everyone know that he smoked it every day of his life. And at one point he wrote a letter to President Eisenhower telling him that he thought it should be legalized. I mean, Armstrong could just never understand what the whole thing was against it. I mean, he looked at all these guys who were lush heads, in the jazz scene, who were really drinking themselves, and damaging themselves. And it would just, he just couldn't understand it. It's guys, why don't you just try this? It's so much nicer. It's so much easier. It's you wake up the next morning and you feel great. You just you don't have a hangover. You're not stumbling around in the streets. And plus, he clearly relished the relationship between being high and playing music. He never talked about it specifically, but scores of musicians around him that came to smoke it with him, talk about, what a integral part of his whole life it was. And yes, the smile, it was always identified with his genial live and let live nature, I love the way that Duke Ellington characterized him as a man who was born poor, died rich, and never hurt anyone along the way. That was him. Now, what did marijuana have to do with, that whole aspect of his consciousness, of his sensibility? He never specifically talked about it, but it's kind of easy enough to kind of read into it, The other thing was, he never talked about the impact that it had on his music, but it had to have been formidable, I use the famous line from Baudelaire's poem of Hashish, where he says that, he calls hashish a mirror. What is the exact quote? It's a mirror, yet only a mirror. Something, words to that effect. In other words, what he's saying is that it's going to take something that's already there and show you different perspectives on it. It can amplify something. It can change your point of view about something, but it's not going to take something that's not already there, and just kind of it's the value of it in terms of like a kind of creative impetus. Most artists and writers and musicians would say that it's out of that sort of amplification, that sort of sensitivity that it creates to something that's already there. Someone once said that a miracle, the best way to define a miracle, is a simple change in perspective. One moment you're seeing something one way, and then the next moment you're looking at that same thing from another point of view. And I think that is what cannabis was giving these musicians, and it's really kind of fascinating to like look at the musical innovations that they became known for and to kind of conjecture, well, how could, it took these prodigious talents and it just kind of like, it made them more playful. It made them more bold. Some people have said it could break up time and change your perception of rhythm and all kinds of things like that. There was a whole palette of things that the kind of marijuana consciousness could bring to a musical experience, as well as just the kind of intimacy that it could create between musicians. I write about the first recording session that Lester Young had with Billie Holiday. They barely knew each other, and the session was commenced with a shared marijuana joint, and it just created this. It didn't create talent that wasn't already there, but what it did was it fostered a kind of ambience, created a tone that somehow, they were able to elevate with each other. It was the beginning of really a beautiful musical romance between the two of them. Mm-hmm. So,
well, the story of Billie Holiday kind of pulls into this next question, because we can see how incredible and positive cannabis was in the jazz music culture, and we can even see in the evolution of different musical styles that have been directly influenced by cannabis as well. But in the beginning, when we were talking, you mentioned how you saw that some of these drugs were really opening you and some of them were really closing you down. There was a price to be paid, and sometimes the price was less than the gain, and other times it was vastly more. And so the story of the evolution of jazz music and its relationship with drugs is beautiful, and it's also tragic, not only because of the intense systemic racial oppression that was being embodied in the drug war on behalf of Harry Anslinger, but also in the emergence and the almost like inferno of heroin and heroin addiction that spilled into the jazz community, and then beyond the jazz community spilled into the black communities in Harlem and other places, which were, problematic is understatement of the year. Can you talk about the emergence of heroin into the general jazz music culture, and if possible, maybe touching on the stories of Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, and John Coltrane?
Sure. Well, there had been heroin around since the turn of the century. Heroin powder also begins showing up on the streets right around the time that jazz is coalescing, and cannabis shows up in New Orleans. In the 1920s, it was mostly underground as a result of all of these people who had been addicted to opiates, who were kind of they had no place to go once the laws came along, the Harrison Narcotic Act. And, there was 20,000 doctors in the United States were prosecuted by the FBN for trying to help these people who were already addicted to opiates, by the time the law came along. So that was the beginning. It was the law that created the underground in narcotics. Okay, so you have to kind of begin with that premise. Now, by the 30s, people were just starting to learn how to use needles. The use of intravenous needles were beginning to spread in the underground. Now, in Kansas City, which was the crucible that, swing was born in, this incredible jazz music that was happening along 12th Street in the African-American communities, these clubs like the Reno, right in that neighborhood, there was a teenager, Charlie Parker, and, he started coming to the jazz clubs. And, there are those among us who are just naturally, for whatever reason, genetic, predisposition, environment, character, psyche, any combination, are just naturally predisposed to addiction, to being an addictive personality. And Charlie Parker was one of them. I mean, he was fascinated by drugs from, his early teenage years. He tried everything. He had an enormous capacity, and he was addicted to heroin for the first time as a 16-year-old in 1937. And it would always remain a part of his story. The other significant aspect about Charlie Parker, or of course Bird as he became known, was he was a natural musical genius. So as natural as, addiction predisposition was, that's how natural his musical acumen was, his unbelievable ability to innovate and explore, and his musical ambition. It was vast. So this musical character was developing at the same time that this addictive character was developing. And in his case, they became one. And, so he leaves Kansas City, he hops on a freight train and, shows up in New York in the 1940s. There was a period where he was able to stay off heroin. He sort of recognized that it was going to get in his way of kind of making his bones, so to speak, to really getting his career going. But once he connected with this circle of musicians in New York, I mean, he performed in big bands and, Jay McShann's orchestra, and, he had a reputation as a kind of this wild drug user at the same time that he was this player. But the habit came back at a very kind of key moment. And that was the moment when this whole bebop revolution was, really coming together in this little club called Mittens, in the basement of the Cecil Hotel up in Harlem. This little group of musicians, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Kenny Clark, Bud Powell, who literally in night to night, moment to moment, were inventing what became known as modern jazz, in these jam sessions. And Bird was he was like the spark plug in the engine. He was the Dizzy Gillespie called him the architect. He had the vision. He was the guy. And, so right when his habit is like really coming back to claim him is when he is moving into the spotlight as this key musical character. And, these young guys, these players would come and they would watch him, and they would be like open mouthed. They just couldn't believe it, and because they knew about his lifestyle, they knew he was the kind of guy, he just lived large, he's passionate, everything, not just music, drugs, sex, learning about things he was interested in. He was one of those guys. There was no boundary between any of his passions. And they knew that he was a junkie. They knew that he would spend a day in a hotel room, not only with a spike in his arm, but, drinking a fifth of whiskey and, smoking a reefer one after another with a woman with him between his legs, filleting him. And then he would like get up on a stage and somehow he would just take flight. That's why they called him Bird. There was a more mundane origin of the name. He found these two dead birds along the road on the way to a date, and he got this woman to cook them at the boarding house. But that's where Bird comes from, Yardbird. But the real power of Bird was the metaphor of, taking flight. And so that this drug became associated with that flight. And so all these guys, he went out to LA and there were these young musicians out there that were like Bird, they wanted to do everything he did. And so they picked up. And then what happened to him out there was he went out with Dizzy's group to like showcase the new bebop at this club out there. And it didn't really go well. Bird stayed out there because he got so strung out. He didn't know the ropes out there of where to find dope. Eventually he found a dealer out there, but then the dealer got busted and he was just like strung out horribly in a way that he had never been before. And that's when he got the Dial session to record. He needed the money, and he recorded this song "Lover Man," which was a song Billie Holiday had done a few years before. And he goes into the studio, and he's strung out, and he takes all this Benzedrine because he thinks that, they're goofballs and that somehow it's going to palliate the symptoms of withdrawal. But it's speed. He's taking speed. He doesn't even know it. And that fucks him up even more. So that there he is with a horn in his mouth trying to record this music. And he's given it everything he has. But, you can kind of hear him. He's breaking inside. And then he crumbles and has this breakdown and ends up in the psychiatric ward out in California. And this song is released and people know what's happened to him and they hear this music, the pathos of it, and somehow, it gets romanticized. These people, these musicians, they hear him playing like this and they go, wow, Bird is like, he's so strung out there, but there's a kind of beauty and truth to what he's doing. And so that all of it becomes like fused into this one thing: beauty, truth, flight, this drug, this rebellion that's going on. Don't forget that all of these guys, there was a lot of force pushing these guys to try it. And of course, and none of them really knew what they were getting into. They didn't really have a clue. So that what you have by 1950 is like these, this vanguard, this wave of these brilliant young jazz artists, all of them, with the exception of a few, heroin addicts. It's just extraordinary. It's just unprecedented. And so what I do is I follow them all through this experience of this drug. And all of their stories are different because that's what happens with people are different, and their stories with the drugs will be different. And, Charlie Parker, of course, dies young at 33, just this physically ruined guy, but who is like, by that time is like lionized by this culture, just, loved, represents this kind of creative and freedom, really, that they see. And, Billie Holiday gets busted, of course, numerous times. And a big part of her story becomes about dealing with that. She goes to prison, she comes out, she reclaims her career. She becomes this figure, this mythic figure, this songstress of like pain and sorrow and heroin, which becomes in a way her brand. And at the same time is this genius vocalist. And Miles Davis, who kicks heroin and becomes this figure of regeneration and rebirth. And John Coltrane, who is in Miles's band, who, as Miles is coming back, is spiraling down, just completely losing control of himself, who is also this incredible talent. And Coltrane tries to kick it, and what happens to him is also very different. He has a spiritual awakening. He has this moment, this epiphany, this God epiphany, really, that, really will set become the star that he will follow through the rest of his musical life. And he creates this spiritually imbued music as a result of it that changes the course of jazz. So it's a fascinating story. And while this is all going on, heroin is like pouring into, Harlem as a result of, the mafia, building the worldwide trade in heroin and making a decision, we're going to market our product here in this place, where the cops will kind of like turn a blind eye. Some of them will like get into the actual trade itself. The nothing bred corruption more than the narcotics trade. And all these kids, this young generation of, African-American kids now coming into this experience. I mean, if you ever want to really know what it was like for these kids, read Claude Brown's classic book, Man-Child in the Promised Land. I mean, that's literally what it's about. It's about that generation of kids, who were on the streets of Harlem in 1947 when Bird comes back from California, has his big moment, and this the product, the heroin product, begins just like, wow, you can almost follow it. It like begins on this block, moves to that block, goes to that square, and just like it's like before you can bat an eye, it's like from one end of 125th Street to the other. And there was nothing, there was no place for these people to go. It was just horrible. At that point, they made the laws even more draconian. There was, the only thing that they could think of doing was throwing them in prison.
Well, that was part of Englinger's whole mandate, was that the only way to stop the rapid spread of heroin is to make tougher and tougher laws. To scare people into not taking it anymore.
Yes, that was the beginning. In the 50s, the anti-narcotic laws was the beginning of what became the mandatory minimum sentences. And if you look at that was, if you wonder why, in the United States, we have the largest prison population in the world, with it's grossly, disproportionately black, and has been, forever. But these are like directly from the crack era. It all begins in this period, in the 50s with, heroin, narcotics, it was really, that's why, some of them became martyrs in a way. I mean, when Billie Holiday passed away, she was arrested on her deathbed, busted. And at that time, there was, for the first time, a program that they were trying to put into place that would allow drug addicts in hospitals for the first time. They couldn't take them into hospitals. They could detox in a jail cell if they wanted to, but there was no bringing them into a hospital to try to treat them. Exactly. So when Billie passed away, it was like, she became the symbol in a way of that. It was, she was a drug addict and she was brought into this hospital and she was arrested there. And the people who, this whole movement of community groups had been coming together in Harlem to lobby the city to try to allow addicts into the hospitals. And they wouldn't do it for years and years and years. The state didn't want to do it. The federal government didn't want them to do it. Finally, they did it, but not until after she died. I mean, in a way, she became the symbol of getting that done. Of the humaneness of the basic policy of trying to treat addiction as a sickness and not just as a criminal issue. So now, you look at, we have this new heroin epidemic going on in rural white America and working class America, where for the first time, what you have are things like harm reduction strategies being used, like this Narcan, this naloxone, which can save a person's life if they're ODing on heroin. They're allowing the police to have that now. And you see all of these, like the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, going on about how, please come to these treatment centers. Everyone deserves a second chance. That was inconceivable back in the 40s and the 50s when, the addicts were mostly, African American. It was just inconceivable. And now something like that is happening. Like, finally, is it because it's happening among, a white segment of the population? I don't know. I mean, there are people who have looked at it and said, well, this is nice that this is happening now. What happened in the 80s and the 90s with crack? When, you didn't see people who were sick and who, needed another second chance at life. You saw thugs, drug criminals, killers who needed to be put away for decades. So there's a lot of bitterness about it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, it's very, very interesting and very controversial.
Mm-hmm. I would like to think that the evolution of harm reduction and the acknowledgement of addiction, especially opioid addiction, as being a sickness, I'd like to think that the evolution of that is just an evolution of, is a maturation process, an expression of us maturing as a civilization. But given the undeniable racism at the very foundation of drug policy in the modern world, it feels almost naive to say that it's simply a maturation thing and is not in some way directly connected to the spread of these issues into, quote, with like white people, because I appreciate that the change is happening, but it is undeniable to see, in my opinion, that it's part and parcel, that it's no longer just people of color,
that it's spreading out. I agree. I mean, don't think for a second that Donald Trump isn't aware that, the opiate epidemic, the whole problem, which came from prescription pills and is now, heroin, is in the parts of the country where he gets his support from. Mm-hmm. He's abundantly aware of that, so that I believe that this policy of really trying to help people, which is more humane, will continue because of that. But at the same time, you have this guy Sessions in, the new Attorney General, who's really an old line, Neanderthal drug warrior, who's going to try to roll back all of the gains in reform, whether it's reforming the sentence structure of sending people away, whether it's medical marijuana, whether it's actual legal marijuana, where it is now legal, he's going to try to roll it back.
Mm-hmm. So the struggle is definitely still real, even here in Canada, because there's a bill that was recently brought to the federal, to our House of Commons, that basically would make it so that because up here in Canada, we have a severe issue with fentanyl addiction and with fentanyl contamination in opioid and non-opioid drugs, which is creating a lot of overdose deaths. And there was a bill that was passed or put forward that said something along the lines of, if you call an ambulance because of an opiate overdose, you have immunity. You have immunity for making the call, as in if you've got heroin or whatever drugs on you, you're not going to get charged, just as long as you make the call. And as far as I know, it was denied. And why would it be denied other than maintaining political trajectory from the past, which is a history of racism and classism as well, because in the early days, classism was defined by race. And it has definitely blended a lot more since then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So awkward moment to sort of come into closure with the interview here. I want to express that your ability to like I said before, drop into the living reality while reading, especially insofar as the heroine talks about heroin, becomes a very primary theme in the book. It was just incredible. I found myself in the early phases really feeling the excitement and the allure of these people. Wow, the heroine. In my mind, I'm maybe one day it could be and then I just continue to follow it. And as it evolves, it just gets increasingly darker. It's almost again, this archetypal process that we had mentioned we both had in our lives, from, the gateway to illumination through to stumbling through untruths into a mess and looking back and trying to make sense of it. The same thing was sort of happening with the heroin culture, because all of a sudden it was just a mess. And it was a mess before anyone knew what was going on, because by the time people realized that it was a problem, it was a mass amount of population that was stuck and addicted. And your ability to represent that, to take me from a place at one point maybe it's kind of interesting, and then at another point to hold my arm and be I'll never do it to you, I promise. And the way that you talked about how there was this one line that really caught me about heroin addiction, which is that heroin addiction makes all of life's problems a singular problem.
That was Charlie Parker said that.
That all of a sudden, every problem you could possibly conceive of in your life is reduced down to one: getting more heroin.
Right. I mean, a lot of people could never understand how that would actually be looked upon as a positive thing. But when you have a million things in your life, you have the police after you, you're black, they're condemning you because you're with a white person, the clubs are trying to rip you off. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If I'm only worrying about, hey man, where am I going to score? Then, you don't have to think about that other stuff. You just kind of move on. And I think that was a part of it. And there were other parts of it too. I mean, like any drug in any set, the whole set and setting, concept, if you look at that in heroin in the jazz culture of the 40s and 50s, I mean, one thing that, look, it's so misunderstood. I mean, my book was reviewed in the New York Post so stupidly. I mean, some guy, he all he wrote about was Charlie Parker and heroin. And the headline was something to the effect of, heroin addiction helped make Charlie Parker a genius. What a stupid fucking thing to say. I never said it anywhere. I mean, I did say, yes, it was an important part of his narrative, musical and otherwise. Never made him a fucking genius. It was just idiotic. And there's that kind of misapprehension all over the place about it. I mean, Dexter Gordon said something interesting to in one of the oral histories of the jazz of that era. He was talking about, what impact heroin had. And he said, it was your lifestyle. And when you were a musician, really what you were playing was your lifestyle. And that really kind of resonated for me, how the heroin became a part of the content itself, of the substance of the music, as well as the life around it, So, and the really astounding thing, if you think of it, was how these guys, strung out like that, still managed to create this classic American music is really remarkable. Really remarkable. And they did.
Mm-hmm. And very... I don't want to go too much into a whole other topic, but it is the whole premise of Junkie and of the pitfalls of heroin addiction in and of itself, like that stereotype that's bred of the results of hardline racial prohibition and prejudice and the misrepresentation in the media of the realities of drug addiction and drug culture almost push people into embodying the caricature, into embodying the stereotype, wherein the drug themselves, if present in an otherwise non-damaging social environment, poses a significantly less of a problem, especially with heroin, which is how there's I can't remember the European country that basically solved a lot of their heroin problems and illicit heroin market by legal administration of heroin, and that people can live their whole lives on heroin.
Yeah, they've tried that to a degree in the UK. Portugal has had a lot of success with it. So, I mean, look, we've come a long way. Even so, look, in the 80s, there were people who just said, duh, these addicts are spreading the AIDS virus and hepatitis. Let's give them some clean needles so that in these shooting galleries, the disease isn't spreading. Mm-hmm. And they would not let them do it because it sent the wrong message, right? And that's kind of what we've had to, that's what we've had to deal with. This is what's the message? Do we care about human life to the point where we want to try to save these people? Or are we so worried about some moral ideology that you think should be like the right message about whether or not people are going to use drugs or not? Mm-hmm. So if we try to save these people's lives, I mean, it's so crazy when you think about it. Well, we're not going to send the message that it's okay. We're not going to give them, clean needles to save their lives, because that's going to say that we think it's okay to use drugs. And this is the mindset that we've had to contend with, like throughout the entire course of this, this history.
Mm-hmm. And it's again, it's one that I'm happy to see. I'm happy to see changing face, whatever the reasons might be that the face is changing. I'm happy to see that the face is changing on how we as a society are relating to the presence of drug use in our culture. And I want to, again, thank you very much, Martin, for writing your book, because it definitely, it gives it's the only book that I've read on that specific time frame. And I feel like I've walked away with a firm grasp of both the pros and cons, and like the elegant tragedy and the highs and the lows of that whole sort of movement. It really laid out a lot for me in a positive way, and seems to me like it's sending a good message. So thank you so much for writing the book.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Before we cut the recording here, where can people get copies of your book and learn more about the other books that you've written, the films that you've produced?
Well, they can go on my website, martintorgoff.com. It's all on there. They can buy the book through the link to Amazon. It is in bookstores. Someone sent me a friend of mine from a bookstore in St. Paul. He's a professor of music out there. It was in Garrison Keillor's bookstore. It was right next to Bruce Springsteen's book, which really made me feel good. So it's in bookstores. It's on Amazon. Go on my website. It's all my other books are on there. All of my, my film work is on there too. And, I blog from time to time, and the blogs are on there, and, that's me.
So martintorgoff.com to basically get your hands on anything, digital anything about you, and to check out Bop Apocalypse in your store. Ask for it. If it's not there, guys, ask for it. This is the book here if you're watching on YouTube. Bop Apocalypse, really wonderful. Martin, thanks so much, man.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening to the show today. Martin is just such an incredibly interesting wealth of information. And I really appreciated having him on the show, and I also really appreciated reading his book. So if you liked the episode, you'll probably like more of Martin's work. He's got some lectures up online, and of course you could go and treat yourself to a copy of Bop Apocalypse, which I think would be a great idea, especially if you were interested in the show and wanted to dip in a little bit deeper into his hard work and source material for the content we discuss. Of course, I would love it if you gave this show a big shout out on social media, and whatever social media you are on, you can tag me. If I'm on that platform, I'm at James W. Jesso. Tag me up. Send me some love through iTunes as well as an option. Reviews, like I said before, you could get that super cool opportunity of having it read on the show. And lastly, contributions to the show are actually very vitally important. So if you'd like to help see this show grow, leaving a one-time donation through PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming my patron on Patreon would be really meaningful and very supportive to the growth and blossoming of this show. You can find more details about that and more details about everything that you hear me say at jameswjesso.com, and for support specifically, jameswjesso.com/support. Thank you so much for listening to this all the way to the end, and have yourself an absolutely wonderful couple of weeks, and I will see you on the next episode.